We're looking at a positional heat map today of teams that drafted running back at a certain position in their fantasy draft and how it affected their playoff advance rate. Is it hot?
Heat map.
Because of heat map?
Yep.
So we're going to dive into this data. It's really interesting. Take a look at this first graph on the screen. This is from last year. This is from 2023. And you'll notice right off the bat when you look at this, there are some clear hot spots and there are some clear low spots here. Or
danger zones.
Danger zones. That's what we're going to call them.
Cold sores.
So the first hotspot you're going to notice is, of course, right up front. Basically, and here's how you use this as well. You'll see the 101 is 21.8%. That's 21.8% above the average playoff advance rate at that position if you drafted a running back. Basically, what this Team 1 and Team 2 number is saying, that 18 to 21%, is if you drafted Christian McCaffrey, you were 18 to 21% more likely than average to advance to the playoffs with your fantasy team.
Specifically, if you drafted Christian McCaffrey over Jamar Chase, because if you remember, what was very common in fantasy football last year?
It was Chase, it was Jefferson, Chase, and then Christian McCaffrey.
Yes.
But also Jefferson, because Jefferson was hurt last year. So again, and that's not groundbreaking analysis. So we're going to look at the rest of this, though. Even looking at 2022, if we can have this graph, we can have both the 2023 and 2022 graphs up, because I'm going to look at some things here. We're going to identify first some hot spots about, where people were drafting running backs historically in the last 2 years. And this data comes to us via RotoViz, via Underdog, which is all best ball data. This best ball data is absolutely applicable to your fantasy football leagues. In every redraft, best ball, even Dynasty production, it absolutely is going to apply, because when you're talking about best ball and when you're talking about fantasy football, the top 7-8 rounds are all players that you're going to be starting every week because those are your studs, right? And so any effect that where you're having wins over replacement or things like that, or you have above average win rates, that's going to apply to your fantasy football leagues as well. Because again, these are players that you're going to be starting all year unless they're injured, which would also take into account with fantasy football data. So looking at this now, the first and most obvious takeaway, like I said, was Christian McCaffrey will single-handedly carry you to the playoffs if he is Christian McCaffrey form. So, I think he is the unquestioned 101 right now in fantasy football drafts. So I'm not even going to spend a lot of time on that. But looking, you'll notice that there are some hot spots here from the last couple of years. The most notable one to me that happened in both years really strongly was round 7 and 8. Okay. So let's look at round 7 and 8, and let's look at who was being drafted in those rounds, because you'll notice in 2022, there's a stretch of 6% higher, 6% higher, 7% higher, 7% higher, 5% higher at the 7-8 turn there when people were drafting running backs. Even going back into the 7th. When you're looking at 2023, kind of the same thing. It's not as much, but it goes from, hovering around 0 to 2%, 3%, 4%, 5% higher at the 7-8 turn. So then the question is, what were those people who were drafting doing at the 7-8 turn? Who were they drafting that was giving them that boost? Why was their average playoff advance rate that much higher? And so let's look at the players that were going there, and we'll start with 2023. Yeah,
so with 2023 in that range, you've got guys like James Conner going in that range. You've got Rachaad White, Alvin Kamara, and Isaiah Pacheco. And at face value, when you look at all 4 of those guys, what's the common denominator between all of them? Is it, let's do some elimination here.
Okay, cool.
Is it their rushing volume?
No.
Not necessarily, because Kamara isn't known for rushing volume.
Didn't have rushing volume last year.
Pacheco ended up being, RB15 on the year.
Yeah.
Played on, a team that Kansas City ran the ball more than usual, but it wasn't anything out of this world.
But James he's being drafted as the running back 30. So,
right. And were they wildly efficient running backs?
No.
Not really. So where does that leave us? That leaves us with touchdowns and receiving upside. All 4 of these running backs were very, very notable, specifically with their receiving upside, starting with Alvin Kamara. We all know the story with Alvin Kamara last year. He came in after a 3 or 4 game suspension, and he still had 86 targets on the year and 75 receptions. James Conner, 13 games. He only had 33 targets and 27 receptions, but he had 7 touchdowns and he had over 1,000 rushing yards that year. His efficiency went up to 5 yards per carry. Then you have Pacheco. When you're looking at Isaiah Pacheco, 49 targets, 44 receptions, 7 touchdowns, and again, almost 1,000 yards. You're looking at our last guy here, Rachaad White. Rachaad White, huge last year, and we think huge again this year. 70 targets, 64 receptions, 549 yards.
Yeah. I mean, it's pretty clear. And when you look at 2022 even, so these guys that were drafted in this range in 2022 on the screen, you've got guys like Josh Jacobs, Tony Pollard, Ramondre Stevenson, Miles Sanders here. Starting with Ramondre Stevenson had 88 targets in 2022 for 69 receptions. Nice. And 421 yards. Oh, it's so close. 1 yard from 69 receptions and 420 yards. That would have been amazing.
That would have been legendary.
By the way, if you play fantasy football, make sure you hit subscribe. We're trying to get as many subscribers as we can to get people to join our community. So if you're watching, you enjoy this, hit the like button, make sure you subscribe. But 69 receptions is really nice. And then also Miles Sanders that year, he was the one guy that, although in 2022 he was the running back 15, his was more touchdown dependent. So he had 11 touchdowns because he only had 26 targets that year.
In the 7th and 8th round, if you're getting a high-end running back too, that is a massive, massive win. And that's going to really up your chances at advancing in the playoffs.
Tony Pollard was the running back 8 in 2022, and he had 55 targets
this
that year.
This is pre-running back 1 overall expectations, Tony Pollard, where he was a running back 2 alongside Ezekiel Elliott and had a ton of receiving upside again and was able to take even some touchdowns with Zeke taking them all in the red zone.
And Josh Jacobs, the last guy, having 64 targets that year. So all of those guys had 50 or more targets besides Miles Sanders. And even if you're looking at some more guys in this range, I wonder if it checks out for the rest of these guys. David Montgomery was there. I'm not sure what his targets were like that year, but he was also a guy that was notoriously a touchdown guy because although he had 40 targets that year. So, but he had 5 touchdowns. So again, in the 10 cases we looked at over 2 years, 8 of them were guys that we could confidently say had good receiving upside.
Common denominator there, definitely the receiving upside. If not, it was the touchdowns after that. And if not, it was the efficiency like James Conner, which what did we know about James Conner going into 2023? That he had improved his efficiency from 2021 to 2022. And that he was going into a bell cow workload when he was healthy.
Right.
And we knew that he had gotten, that he's gotten better the older he's become, which is really, really weird. But that's something to keep an eye on even for this year as well. Now, you're looking at some other ranges here in your fantasy drafts because not everyone obviously is going to get the chance or get a crack at a running back in the 7th, 8th round, depending on the value falls. So what were some other hot spots that we found? This hotspot wasn't as huge as the 7th and 8th round and like clear cut and dry, but let's look at the 4th round. Let's look at the 4th round of your fantasy draft specifically, because this was a range that was notable and had some bigger names, but also had a lot of payoff as well. When you're looking at 2023, the early to mid 4th round, guys like Joe Mixon, Travis Etienne, Breece Hall, Najee Harris, and Aaron Jones were going in that round. If you remember, Najee Harris was kind of the sexy pick because he had a bad year in 2022 and everyone was expecting a resurgence. He didn't really have that great of a year. He was a little bit better, still a lower half of the league running back for sure.
Yeah.
But he still had some production. He wasn't losing you leagues. Aaron Jones was helping you advance to the playoffs. He was very, very productive when he wasn't injured. Joe Mixon had a slow start to the season because he got absolutely no touchdowns. He picked it up towards the end of the year once Joe Burrow went down with injury, and really the offense was run through him. Travis Etienne, I mean, talk about touchdowns. Yeah. Travis Etienne was one of the top guys, one of the top running backs in the league last year who had a ridiculous amount of touchdowns. And then Breece Hall, probably the most clear, obvious pick that you should have taken in the 4th round last year of your fantasy drafts because he was an elite, hyper-talented, hyper-productive running back that we knew had, elite production upside, and he was the cheapest one going in that range because he was coming off an ACL injury, and people didn't know if he was going to come, fully ready to go at the beginning of the season. But guess what? Lesson learned from that. You don't play fantasy football for the beginning of the season, you play for the end of the season, and we knew Breece Hall was going to be healthy and a full go in the latter half of 2023. And that's what happened. He ended up contributing to your playoff advance rates for sure.
Yeah, and then looking at 2022 for the same range, you've got guys like James Conner. James Conner in 2022, he had 7 touchdowns that year, but he had 58 targets. That was the second most of his entire career that year. And so you saw him being drafted there. And again, the targets are going to stick out to you. But also in 2022, in that range, you've got Travis Etienne again, Ezekiel Elliott. I mean, I know we've been critical of Travis Etienne, but I do see why he could be a good fantasy pick at that price because of the floor that his receiving upside offers that he's probably going to get regardless of how much work he gets there. Yeah. The touchdowns are volatile, but the receiving work he gets with the touchdowns are not. And so it just comes down to basically like drafting a guy with a higher floor. And it's all going to depend on what his ADP is this year. But Ezekiel Elliott in 2022 as well was a guy who didn't have the targets because you had Tony Pollard getting that, but he had 12 touchdowns. So again, touchdowns or targets. Those are the 2 T's that we're looking for there. But again, those are kind of the hot spots that we've seen over the last couple years. And I think if you look at the win rate analysis, you'll see that for yourself. There was, you see it in the 4th, you see it in the 7th and 8th, and obviously you see the Christian McCaffrey effect. So with that being said, who are the guys this year that are going in those ranges? You obviously have Christian McCaffrey. He is the 101 right now. And he's going to, again, if he's healthy, he's going to carry you to the playoffs. So
where he should be.
He's your pick at 101 almost always until you have to get to so many teams where you need to diversify in fantasy football. But then the other ranges here are, was it 4-5 turn, 3-4 turn? It was...
Yeah, it was like
3-4 turn. And this year when you're looking at those picks in terms of running backs... Derrick Henry is going there, not a guy with receiving upside, but a workhorse back that's going there. And when you're getting
unicorn
workhorse,
of all unicorns,
which is, it says everything you should need to know. Travis Etienne's still going at pick 40. So to me, I'm not gonna lie to you. If I get to pick 40 and Travis Etienne's there, I'm fine taking him there. Like, because I think
in fantasy, yes,
in
I'm a
fantasy
lot more,
and best ball, because like that's like into the 3rd. Like the dynasty hype I get, but like in redraft, that's a fair price for Etienne in my opinion. Josh Jacobs is going there, so a guy that who knows what he's going to do this year, but we aren't particularly high on him. Isaiah Pacheco is going there still, and then let's go to like the 7th and 8th round, that other big hot spot that we've been able to see where there's been a lot of success with running back. This is pretty telling. Ramondre Stevenson still in that range. I would be willing to take that bet. Interestingly enough, Zamir White is in this range. Zamir White, somebody who's going to be a workhorse, you're getting him at a discount. Maybe Zamir White ends up being a good pick in fantasy this year. We obviously aren't huge fans of the hype around Zamir White, but again, you're talking about 7th, 8th round. So if he gets to the end, if he gets to the 7-8 turn, I'd probably take Zamir White there.
But again, what was the correlation that we saw between like successful running backs in that range? It was generally their receiving upside, and we know that Zamir White, even in a limited sample size, offered no receiving upside whatsoever. So that's something to keep in mind in that range. If you're going to pass up on a running back, because there were, like in fairness, in the 7th and 8th rounds over the last couple of years, there were some running backs that didn't pan out. Dalvin Cook was going in that range last year. That did not work. That did not work at all.
The only running backs you saw in that range, though, that weren't receiving guys were bell cow backs that fell all the way there. That guys that had a clear shot at like almost all of the workload. And so Zamir White does fit that category. So although the majority
like a James Conner type.
Exactly. And even Ezekiel Elliott.
What's the difference between James Conner and Zamir White?
No, I'd say Jim Conner has plenty of receiving upside.
Yes.
So no, but I'm saying like in terms of the touchdown guys. So in the 7th and 8th round, I'm talking about guys like Isaiah Pacheco there. Isaiah Pacheco is a good example. In 2022, Josh Jacobs didn't have a ton of receptions there.
In 2022, Jacobs?
In 2022, Miles Sanders was the best example of that. Miles Sanders had like 26 targets, and he was going there. He was a guy that had the Eagles' backfield on lock.
Jacobs still had 64 targets in 2022.
Okay, so that's enough for sure.
That's plenty.
So Miles Sanders is really the one there that he was kind of the guy that fell because he was a bell cow back, but nobody thought he was any good. And because of the workload he got a lot of touchdowns.
Right.
So basically it comes down to if you're betting on Zamir White, you're betting on the touchdown upside.
Yes.
So
yes. Now let's go to the flip side here. The flip side, I think, in my opinion, is just as fun because this is really going to help you in your strategy when you're drafting.
You're going to want to hear the other one here.
For position what?
The other guy here is Jonathan Brooks.
Oh.
Jonathan Brooks is going at pick 89. Are you kidding me?
Jonathan Brooks might be the biggest don't stop drafting guy in fantasy this year if he's going at that price.
And Tony Pollard is going below him at pick 95. So those are the guys this year.
Tony Pollard and Jonathan Brooks.
Raheem Mostert is down there. I'll still take Raheem Mostert there. I know I expect regression, but the regression is baked into his price at this point, right? I mean, 8th, 9th round. Those are 4 guys right there with receiving upside. Those are the guys in my opinion.
Ramondre, Pollard, Mostert,
Brooks, and Mostert. Yep. So again, I knew you'd want to hear that. Those 2 guys though are going to be focal point guys for our content this year.
Oh my goodness. Oh boy.
Yeah.
Ooh, that makes me excited.
There's more videos to come out of that.
There's more videos to come out.
All right, now flip it.
Sure. So flip side. Let's look at our danger zones.
Bum, 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 bum.
Late first and early second. I know you guys hate hearing this because it gets really, really ugly with running backs once those top 8 are gone. Top 6 really in this day and age.
Well,
but
ugly. It's perceived as ugly, but the data shows that the ugliness is actually in that top 8 range.
Right. It is quite crazy how much of a disadvantage you were at in 2023 if you drafted a running back at the end of the first, early second. Those of you who watch the channel in fantasy in 2023 remember us hard advocates against drafting Tony Pollard in the beginning of the beginning of the second, late first. And oh my gosh, like you're in big trouble if you drafted him there because of the vacated volume fallacy, everyone expecting him to be a top 4 running back lock. Who are some other guys going in that range? Awesome. Not great. Nick Chubb, that was unfortunate. I was against Nick Chubb's price. You liked Nick Chubb's price. We never got to see what actually was going to happen with him. He could have ended up being a top 6, honestly, in last year's landscape. He probably would have ended up being a top 6 running back.
Yeah.
Saquon Barkley, despite getting all of the workload on the Giants offense, their team was so bad that he was so inefficient and he could never even get to the end zone because everyone knew where the ball was going to. Yeah. Austin Eckler, another big one here. Like, oh my gosh. Austin Eckler was probably one of the biggest disappointments in fantasy last season. Some people expected a little bit of regression. No one expected him to be as bad as he was last year. No one expected the Chargers as a team to be as bad as they were last year. Eckler was no exception. He really screwed you up. 2022, Alvin Kamara, Joe Mixon, Najee Harris, and Saquon Barkley. Mixon's a funny one to hear there in 2022 because he actually ended up being a very productive running back, but it was because of really a couple of games where he scored like 50 points and then the rest was kind of mediocre.
Yeah.
Saquon Barkley, again, another poor year on a poor offense. Najee Harris, one of the most disappointing running back years that we've seen in a long time, given his respective price. Alvin Kamara, very inefficient that year, and he didn't score touchdowns, which is why you missed out there if you took him late first, early second.
Now, looking at how that applies to this year, it's going to be a little bit different because you notice a lot of the guys there, especially, so Eckler, Chubb, Kamara, Mixon, and then you have Saquon on there twice. But you've got guys in there that are old and either got injured or aged out, right? And then so you've got the older veteran running backs, and then the other guys there are guys that were really on not super good offenses. Saquon being on there twice, Najee Harris being on there as well, and then Kamara in 2022. That offense was not any good. And so looking at this year's, though, you've got Jahmyr Gibbs, Breece Hall, Bijan, JT, and Saquon again. So what are the odds that Saquon ends up in that range on this list 3 times in a row?
So this is where you have to look at context and situation overall, because what do we know about Saquon Barkley? Saquon Barkley was never dependent on like limited volume and being or like a Tony Pollard type. Like Saquon Barkley, one of the best prospects we've ever seen, has had very productive years on very bad offenses, has struggled with injury. Now he goes on to an offense that has the best offensive line in the NFL. What have we seen over the last 2 years with running backs in that offense? They're high-end running back 2s, low-end running back 1s, and they have half the talent that Saquon Barkley has. So I'm going to kind of leave this open to interpretation.
I will too.
You can look at the data of 2022 and 2023 respectively and say, okay, that's pretty telling to not draft running backs at the tail end of the first. Or you can call your shot and say that Saquon Barkley is going to be really, really productive in one of the best offenses in the NFL. I don't think either is unreasonable, and here's why. More often than not, I would rather have the 7th best wide receiver than the 5th best running back in fantasy football.
So when you look at the positional heat map for wide receiver, what do you expect to see?
I expect to see A.J. Brown in that range. I expect to see a Garrett Wilson in that range.
From last year, yes.
Nakua.
And in terms of the advance rate, you see a lot of green at the 1-2 turn for wide receivers. It's completely flip-flopped. It's inverse. And so in the case of like
some of that is just the nature of the respective prices of the running back position over the last couple of years. And that has gone down because of their lack of success over the last couple of years. So there will be a price point where they inevitably fall, where it will be worth taking them, and maybe this heat map will flip.
Maybe.
And maybe. But again, we're in the day and age of wide receivers. So here's what we're going to say. Here's what I'm going to say. You can't go wrong with taking receiver at the end of the first round. And you cannot go wrong. Like that has been established. You can't go wrong. You might be screwed if you take running back at the end of the first, early second, or it might pay off in a big way this year because Jonathan Taylor is coming back from injury. Saquon Barkley is in the best offense that he's ever been in his entire career.
True.
And Breece Hall is fully healthy.
Yeah. I mean, again, the red flags that you saw before, you don't see this year with those guys. I think for this position, it's not necessarily about which position you draft. It's the position you don't draft. And so I think not drafting wide receiver here is maybe the mistake. You're looking at 2022 heat map, way up when you take wide receiver in the first round. When you look at 2023, way up in the first round and in the tail end of the second. So you see that 2 years in a row that if you take wide receiver when you're at the end of these drafts, your odds are you're going to be better off. And when you're looking at the wide receivers,
a lot safer, that's for sure.
I'm not going to get too much into this because it's going to be its own video, but sitting right there at the turn in terms of wide receivers, Drake London. That's all I'm going to say right now.
There is a chance that Drake London is the #1 league winner this year.
I think absolutely. I mean, you saw that happen. Last year, that guy was CeeDee Lamb, who was like, he had good finishes, but never like an elite finish.
His highest finish before last year was wide receiver 7 overall.
And the difference was obviously he got to wide receiver 7. Drake London's highest finish is wide receiver 31. But the situation completely, the context is completely different.
Kirk Cousins, it's ridiculous the amount of volume that it's night and day.
So
the last big one here, the last big danger zone, you're going to say, oh, this isn't important. Those are late rounds. It absolutely is important when you see the other assets that are going in that range. You cannot fall for the running backs in this range. Danger, danger, danger. And you know why? Because most of these guys that go in the 11th and 12th round are handcuffs with no receiving upside behind a bell cow running back.
Yep.
Bell cow or handcuffs with no receiving upside behind a bell cow running back do not win you your leagues.
No, they do not.
Safety does not win you your leagues in this range in the 11th and 12th round.
So looking at guys that went there in the last couple of years, Alexander Madison, Jamal Williams, A.J. Dillon, Brian Robinson, Damian Harris, Samaje Perine, Antonio Gibson, and Deonta Foreman. A couple of those guys did have receiving upside. Let's go to 2022, though. 2022, Kenneth Walker, Nyheim Hines, Michael Carter, Kenneth Gainwell, James Robinson, Alexander Madison. Again, these are all guys that are being taking his handcuffs that aren't going to be used in the receiving game. Handcuffs that are not used in the receiving
Kenneth Walker
games.
being the outlier there.
Yes.
In 2022.
Because he was a rookie.
Yep.
And I don't think in the 11th and 12th round this year, but we'll check this real quick. Guys in the 11th and 12th round this year running back. Chase Brown. Woo! There you go. That's so perfect. Blake Corum, Ezekiel Elliott, Jerome Ford, Charbonnet has receiving upside. I think that's the good pick there. Rico Dowdle.
Jerome Ford is the big no-no for me there. I mean, we just went through this last year. Like, people were trading away. I remember because I got this deal done in one of my fantasy leagues. I traded Jerome Ford because I got him off waivers.
Yep.
And I sold him for Michael Pittman when Anthony Richardson went down.
Jeez, man. No.
In that, like, don't say it doesn't happen. A lot of you guys playing home leagues, I'm sure you've seen more atrocious trades than that when super desperate people have to deal with injuries like Nick Chubb going down in the early season last year.
So can we draw any hard conclusions from this data? Technically, no, because every year the landscape and the players drafted at certain positions is going to be different. However, it is interesting that the last 2 years, you've seen these kind of same trends all over the positional heat map. And so this was for running back especially. We're going to do this with other positions as well. But in terms of like what to take away from this video, I say make your own analysis and pick the guys that you think based on historical trends will do well when you're drafting in those ranges. You definitely, I think the do not draft ranges are very telling, but you know, in terms of how we're approaching drafts, we tend to approach from an analytical standpoint. So we'll be using this research. But for now, make your own assumptions. We're not saying that this absolutely means this or absolutely means anything, but this is good data to definitely ponder over. So do us a huge favor, and if you play fantasy football, make sure you drop a like on this video, and please make sure you subscribe. They take you 5 seconds to do those two things, and those two things help him and I out so much, and it's also going to grow our channel as we grow together. So we appreciate it. We did put a lot of time into this research, so it would be really, really great if you could do those two things for us. Appreciate you guys so much. What?
Videos are ramping up too.
Oh yeah, we're gonna be doing 3 videos a week now. So you'll get more and then July 4 or 5 videos a week, and then in the season everything you need. So we're here for you. We're dedicated to bringing you really good analytical, thought out research for fantasy football to help you win your leagues. Appreciate you guys. We'll see you later.